Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sulani Madsen, bringing you 3 columns out of the archives on aspects of affirmative action, given the reactions to the recent Supreme Court ruling that using race to discriminate in college applications is wrong. The oldest was the subject of my very first newspaper op-ed, published in 2010 in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer when it still had a newsprint edition. But let's start with the column written the last time the citizens of Washington faced voting on the subject of affirmative action versus merit. Published October 19, 2019, in the Spokesman Review, this column was advocating for citizens in support of merit-based selection, and it was headlined, "We don't need affirmative action choking paths to success." Affirmative action programs are like the choke setting on a lawnmower. They're necessary to enrich the mixture for getting started, but you can't operate efficiently with the choke still on. What is sometimes a useful tool for jump-starting change can quickly begin to undermine the very people it presumes to help. Washington voters overturned quotas and pushed back against affirmative action when they passed Initiative 200 in 1998 with 58% of the vote. Now voters get to have a say again. A yes vote on Referendum 88 means abandoning I-200 to bring back affirmative action in state contracting and hiring. A no vote on Referendum 88 affirms the current commitment to merit-based decision-making. We no longer have a cold engine, and affirmative action is a tool that's past its usefulness. The picture was different in 1975. Washington State University had recently changed the process for reviewing applications for admission to the architecture program. The new process reviewed applications and portfolios with names blacked out. The number of women in my entering class jumped from the typical 2 or 1 or none up to 6 out of the 60 accepted to this program. Knowing the process was merit-based was incredibly valuable to my confidence. In the spring of my thesis year, I walked by the bulletin board where the list of students accepted into the class of 1981 had just been posted. The number of women accepted had more than doubled. I overheard one young man express his disgust at the number of women taking the place of men, and I unloaded on him. Those women were there on their merit, but the shadow of doubt created by affirmative action would dog my generation into our professional careers. Until the passage of I-200, quotas were in place requiring certain percentage to go to minority and women-owned firms for state architect-engineer contracts. It was a logistical nightmare to split the work out for 10% minority and 6% women-owned businesses. Spokane architects have always had many good engineers to choose from, and a cautious habit of spreading their work around. The 3 partners in the only locally certified MBE firm, who have since retired, chafed at being pigeonholed onto state contracts. The quota system did no favors for women-owned businesses either. Architect Ann Heilman Martin let her WBE certificate expire after I-200 passed. She was brought in once for affirmative action window dressing and likened it to being Vanna White. "It was tokenism, never got used for anything worthwhile," said Martin. She abandoned public works contracts and built her business in the private sector. When I-200 passed, many assumed the Office of Minority and Women's Business Enterprise, or OMWBE, would be disbanded. Instead, it reformulated itself as the promoter of affirmative action. It still issues certificates of minority and women business enterprises, then complains that fewer contracts go to women and minority-owned firms. It's a nonsense statistic. After I-200 passed, there was no reason to jump through hoops to be certified. They have no accurate count of the ownership of companies receiving contracts. Supporters of Referendum 88 swear there won't be any quotas this time, but game playing is inevitable. OMWBE has hung on for over 20 years, pushing goals since it can't require quotas. In at least one case, OMWBE tried to pressure a local state institution into dropping the company rated most qualified solely because their statement of qualifications had not specifically mentioned having affirmative action goals. Ironically, the highest-ranked company already had women in ownership, leadership, and staff positions. Didn't matter in the affirmative action game. Passing Referendum 88 would create more layers of bureaucracy seeking to justify its existence. Like a choke left on too long kills the engine, bringing back affirmative action denies the progress we've made. It revives whispered echoes from 30 years ago saying you don't deserve to be here. WSU professor and architect Marty Cowan recently accompanied students to Chicago on a field trip. While touring one building project, their guide kept repeating this was the first high-rise project awarded to a woman architect. The tokenism angle irritated Cowan, who emphasized the best person should get the job. On Thursday, her section of third-year architecture students at WSU gathered to present their studio work for review. Unlike my 1970s class of mostly European American architecture students, this group represented a full range of American melting pot ancestry in a group about evenly split between men and women. They all deserve to be there. They don't need affirmative action choking their path to success. When I wrote that, and I referred to a company that had been, OMWBE tried to pressure, it was Eastern Washington University, tried to pressure Eastern Washington University into dropping the company rated most qualified, which was a company in which I was an owner. Boy, did that tick me off. Wrote them a very firm letter and they backed off. And to their credit, Eastern Washington University stood up and selected the most qualified firm for the job. And Hargraves Hall turned out as a very successful project. So next, I'm going to flash back to a reading of the oldest column in this set of three, published during the legislative budget hearings in March of 2010 in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and also talking about my least favorite government agency. Here's the column. Agreeing to the priorities of government process to solve the state budget crisis sounds so simple, yet we have become accustomed to expecting a variety of services and rarely ask whether they are legitimate functions of government. The Office of Minority and Women's Business Enterprise, OMWBE, is a good example of those unasked questions and unchallenged priorities. OMWBE was created in 1983 to administer a set-aside program for public contracting and to encourage the formation and success of businesses owned by minorities and women. Its continuing necessity was rejected when voters passed Initiative 200 in 1998, prohibiting preferential treatment based on race and gender. OMWBE has continued for the past 10 years to gather statistics, duly reporting each year that a shrinking share of state contracts go to minority and women-owned businesses. This is no surprise, as there is absolutely no incentive for a minority or women-owned business to bother with the certification process. Time better spent building your business. We now have strong minority and women-owned businesses in the marketplace. OMWBE no longer serves a useful purpose, duplicating outreach programs already aimed at supporting small business. I speak with authority, having at one point obtained and maintained a WBE certificate for my new architectural practice. I originally obtained certification to help professional colleagues who were struggling to split off little percentages of mandatory contract set-asides for professional services, and I did not bother renewing certification after the initiative passed. The certificate did nothing except take up time and file space, and OMWBE offered no useful services to my sole proprietorship that were not more readily available through local development organizations. Business was good, and in 1999 I founded a new limited liability company with 3 good friends, 2 men and 1 woman. We could have played games with the ownership to make our firm 51% woman-owned and qualify for OMWBE certification, but chose an honest, equal partnership. We are the kind of successful firm the OMWBE program originally envisioned. However, our state contracts are not reported as part of OMWBE statistics because we choose not to play their games. We compete successfully for state work on a level playing field. Last month, the governor's office asked for citizen suggestions on setting priorities of government and finding solutions to the budget deficit. I suggested abolishing OMWBE at a savings of $3.615 million based on 2007-2009 biennium figures. The governor's budget includes the OMWBE budget at $2.795 million and ranked it as a high priority in the top 90%, according to the Office of Financial Management. This week, House Bill 1087 has been introduced to establish and fund a new OMWBE Advisory Committee to develop a strategic plan to publicize the benefits of certification. A bureaucratic office of questionable purpose will be directed to spend money to study how to better justify its existence. The OMWBE budget is a drop in the $6 billion bucket, but enough drops together and you get a flood. I urge you to contact your legislators in opposition to HB 1087 to encourage a hard look at what our real priorities are. We need to focus on substance. And OMWBE is still there 13 years later. still just as useless. And finally, from this column, published in the Spokesman Review in August of 2021, the most recent column, Washington Department of Enterprise Services has a new draft supplier diversity policy out for public comment until October 31st. The stated purpose is to use, quote, race and gender neutral strategies to increase the amount of contracts that are awarded to small, diverse, and veteran-owned businesses, end quote. It then goes on to rationalize surreptitious ways of using race and gender to award contracts in violation of the will of the voters. The new DES policy is an attempt to implement recommendations from the Office of Minority and Women's Business Enterprises. OMWBE was created in 1983 to manage a traditional affirmative action set-aside program to encourage new business enterprises owned by the right kind of entrepreneurs. When Initiative 200 passed in 1998 prohibiting preferential treatment based on race and gender, there was an expectation the office would be closed. Washington voters reaffirmed our commitment to neutrality in 2018. The current agenda is driven from the governor's office and by a solidly Democrat-controlled legislature. During the last recession, they neglected to take my advice and cut OMWBE under the priorities of government budgeting process. From my first newspaper column published in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer when it still had a print edition in March 2010, and I quoted from the column that there's no incentive for minority or women-owned businesses to bother with the certification process. A decade later, and nothing has changed except the OMWBE budget has increased every year since. Part of that budget paid for publishing the Washington State Disparity Study in 2019, now used to justify their continued existence. Ironically, for a state agency directed at strengthening the purchase of goods and services from Washington businesses, the study was contracted out to a California firm. No disrespect to the experts from out of state, but it's a perfect example of one barrier for new businesses of any size or ownership seeking to do business with the state. Bureaucracies are loath to take chances, preferring long track records over new vendors. The Disparity Study prologue touts the experience of the California study team. Fair enough. Awarding a contract on merit is a good thing, and it's a bonus for OMWBE to have a consulting team with all the right diversity credentials. Or maybe it's not a bonus or merit, but an example of preferential treatment based on race and sex. Hard to tell. For qualified minority and women-owned businesses and individuals, the most exasperating unintended consequence of formal or informal affirmative action is the spoken or unspoken questioning of their competence. Buried in the report is the statement from the California consultant. Certification as an MWBE by the state was reported to confer few benefits, especially in relation to the time required to go through the process, end quote. And I'm going to repeat that. Certification as an MWBE by the state was reported to confer few benefits, especially in relation to the time required to go through the process. Right from the expert consultant. Continuing with the column, the report goes on to collect quotes from state agency staff and vendors. Quote, OMWBE is only there to make a list. I haven't really seen the benefits. Another quote, I've just got to build my business. I'm not relying on these programs. Another quote, we pay all of our money to provide for this certification that does us absolutely no good. Another quote, it's not been helpful for me in any way, shape, or form, and now I'm beginning to wonder if it is hurtful. Following up on that last thought, the report summarizes, quote, some MWBEs felt that certification was actually a detriment because it can be viewed by other firms and agencies as a stigma, a conclusion supported by additional interviews. More quotes. Certification itself is a stigma. Another quote. I found out real quick not even to mention the program or that I'm certified. Being certified firm in and of itself has been a stigma for us. End quote. Not a resounding affirmation for the existence of OMWBE. I still have to dig into the report to see if there are positive results after over 38 years in operation. DES and OMWBE held a workshop for public comment on August 18 via Zoom, which made it convenient for participation across the state. Several Zoom polls were used to gauge participants' reactions. Asking poll questions without allowing for a neither or a none vote can make it appear a proposed course of action has public support. It's one of those subtle ways public comment collection can be used to mislead with impressive-sounding statistics. Undoubtedly, there will be glowing reports on the results of the workshop. Read them with a grain of salt and read the original documents for yourself online. Anyone can play, regardless of race, sex, age, veteran status, and geographic location. No need to show up in Olympia to make your voice heard. And now that I've dug that out and taken a read again, I realize I need to go back and dig into that report and see if there is any proof that OMWB has had any positive impacts in 38 years of government spending. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Forthright. Be sure to like and subscribe for notifications of new content. Free subscriptions are fine to build the audience. Pledges are appreciated. Until next time.